Hello, Christ Covenant. It's great to be with you and to participate in this summer series, the Sunday School series on Christian biography. I have loved biography for such a long time, and if you notice on the list of people that we're profiling, there's lots of people there that you may not have heard of, or you maybe have heard of but don't know much about. And this morning or this afternoon, whenever you're watching this, is probably going to be the same, because we're going to talk about Katie Luther. When you think of the Reformation, you probably think first of our theological heritage and the doctrines that have come from that. Justification by faith alone, sola scriptura, and the like. And you probably think of Reformation figures, key Reformation figures, Martin Luther, John Calvin, Butzer, Melanchthon, the English reformers, the continental reformers, and so on. But within our Reformed tradition, there are hidden gems, many that have been in the background of our history, but played a significant role in that background. And one of those hidden gems is Katie Luther. Not a lot is known about her, but she looms in the backdrop of many of the accomplishments of the Reformation. And that is namely the rediscovery of the holiness of the ordinary. And so that's going to frame a little bit of my talk with you today. As Wittenberg became the staging point of the Reformation, so the home of Martin and Katie Luther became a fixture where the truths of the Reformation were taught and discussed, where they were processed together, a fixture where Christian community was nourished and nurtured. As many of you know, Martin Luther was one of the key figures of the Reformation. He lived from 1483 to 1546. As a young Augustinian monk, most of us are familiar with his story. He struggled to find peace with God in the monastic life. And his mentor, Johann von Staupitz, assigned him to be a professor at the University at Wittenberg. And there, Luther began to study the Scriptures. He began to study the Psalms in particular and the book of Romans. And it's there that he encountered the gracious God who justifies sinners by giving them the righteousness of Christ. And so from his discovery, or we would better understand it, his rediscovery, we have these doctrines of sola fide, sola scriptura, and so on. Luther, witnessing many abuses in the church, both in doctrine and practice, sought reform. And in doing so, he nailed the 95 Theses to the castle door in Wittenberg with the hope of reform. But as we know, the result of that issued in his excommunication at the Diet of Worms in 1521. He was then graciously kidnapped, actually, and tucked away for his own protection in the Wartburg Castle. And there he translated the New Testament into German and continued to write tracts that were against the abuses that he saw in the church. When Luther returned to Wittenberg, though, he faced a real challenge. What now? What would the church look like now? You might wonder if he had just something of a "what have I done" kind of moment. As he returned, he saw the immediate need that this is a movement that needed to be stewarded. How would these doctrinal truths take shape in Christian community? How would they find expression in everyday life? Luther found himself in a new world. And not only did he face the challenge of being a leader in the Reformation, Luther also struggled with personal challenges as well. Luther was bombastic, as many of us know. He was impulsive. He was often plagued with depression and all kinds of physical ailments, mood swings. He suffered from a variety of different plagues of his body. And he also faced death threats as well. And so it begged the question, how could he find his bearings? How would he find his bearings in the midst of this new life with all of these ongoing challenges? Who would God use as a much-needed companion to him in this journey? Enter Katie Luther. In this short time, we're going to skim across the waters of her life and hopefully garner more appreciation for certain dynamics that serve as part of our theological heritage of the Reformation. There were a lot of, as I said, rediscoveries and recoveries that happened in the Reformation. And I think there's three that provide a meaningful backdrop as we think about the life of Katie Luther. One, the recovery of the gospel. Two, the recovery of marriage. And three, the recovery of the home. And so that's the way I framed this talk on her life. And so the recovery of the gospel, from the standpoint of living a consecrated life to God. What does it mean to live a consecrated life before God? That was a pivotal question. In the year 1139, Pope Innocent II codified the prohibition against clergy marrying. And in doing so, he cemented this long-standing notion that marriage was a distraction to the vocation of ministry. Like Pope Innocent II, my learning of Katie actually began with this notion as a seminarian. I saw the prospect of marriage as a distraction to God's call on my life. And even reading some Protestant writers, I struggled to see how singular devotion to God could be compatible with the pursuit of another person and loving and serving alongside of them. And so I broke up with my girlfriend at the time, who is happily now my wife. I was corrected by a professor at Reformed Seminary, the late Harold O.J. Brown. I remember I walked into his office with all the resident pride and piety of a young seminarian. I told him about Michelle, and I said, "Dr. Brown, I want to tell you something. I want to simply focus on my relationship with the Lord." And so I broke up with my girlfriend. And you can imagine my dismay when, expecting to be affirmed, he simply looked up at me and went, "Oh, dear Lord." Dr. Brown referred me to Luther's marriage to Katie and a similar conflict that Luther dealt with before his marriage. And that was the apparent conflict between marriage and singular devotion to God. And so this struggle, it formed an important backdrop for Luther's marriage to Katie and played a role in my life as well. So I went to the library at RTS, and there I read Luther on marriage and the things that he said about it, which was that marriage is a good. It's an institution. It's something instituted by God for His good purposes and for sanctification. Luther had two important writings directly addressing the issue of consecration to God and marriage. That was his writing against monastic vows and his treatise on marriage that he wrote in the early 1520s. In short, part of Luther's answer to monasticism was the holiness of the ordinary. And that brought marriage into the discussion. And that was a paradigm changer for me. We'll talk a little bit more about this at the end, but the details of Katie's early life are sketchy. She was born in 1499 to a noble family that lost their wealth. And at the tender age of 5, Katie's mother died. And at 6, she was sent to be educated at a Benedictine convent school in Brena. This was during the time period of Luther's famous lightning bolt experience as he traveled on the road near Erfurt. He was caught in a thunderstorm, and terrified of death, he vowed to become a monk. And so he entered the Augustinian order at Erfurt shortly after. Katie was not given the choice to enter the convent. Rather, her circumstances forced her into this life. For Luther, it was the terror of God that forced him into this monastic life. And so Katie was sent away as a little girl to relieve the financial burden that raising another child placed on her family. And with that decision, the path of her life, already marked by profound tragedy, was set for her. Around the year 1510, while Luther was walking to Rome in search of peace with God, Katie was sent to another convent in Nipsi. She was about 10 years old, and one can think of the impact that was on this little girl. Not only was she farmed out to the convent, but she was also moved around, essentially orphaned out to the convent. And while it was commonplace for families to designate their daughters to a convent, we can only imagine that this was shaped by the tragedy in her life of losing her mom and growing up estranged from her family. There are two different extremes of monastic life we should mention. One is that the monastic life is something that's a bit of a heaven on earth. It's a retreat, it's a seclusion, and it perfectly embodies Christian community of charity and service. And we all know the monastic life never lived up to that. The other extreme is that these were places with just outward piety, but were filled with inward corruption. And neither one of those are exclusively true or an accurate way to characterize the monastic life. Life in the convent was one of retreat and seclusion from the ordinary world of what we would know, of just normal communal interaction with general people in your town. There was a regimen of prayers and vows and simplicity. Daily life within the convent walls were composed almost entirely of silence. Some of you might be watching this and think, well, that sounds pretty good, to have some silence. And there's certainly benefits to silence and solitude. Be still and know that I am God. And there was a certain focus that comes with the escape of worldly cares. And so Katie had some benefits here. She was well educated, even in Latin, and that would reap tremendous benefits later in her life. And most fundamentally, for her family, she was protected. The life in the convent offered a protected life, at least physical protection. Without marriage, women were effectively denied the right to citizenship during this time, or at least the path to citizenship was extremely narrow. So that was the protection that the convent offered her. It gave her a place where she was not exposed or as exposed and vulnerable. Life in the convent was one where they had to sustain the community in which they lived. And they did so through various duties. They employed farmhands and shepherds, and they looked after horses and cows and geese and apple and pear trees and vegetable gardens. Those were all sustained by the hired hands and the nuns there. And of course, there was the all-important winery and brewery as well. It was a community unto itself. Well, the truth that so much depended on the circumstances and the people involved in the convent was simply the environment and who ran the convent. Was your abbess harsh or was she not? Were they corrupt or were they not? And it seemed like in some ways it was a bit of the luck of the draw, where you landed in one of these places and who you landed with. But by all accounts, Katie at Nipsi landed in a good place where perhaps there was some freedom that other nuns would not have enjoyed. But lurking in the background behind all of this sort of institutional form of monasticism was often a lack of clarity, personal clarity, in vital matters of faith and practice. And we see that in Luther's story. And we also see that in these nuns in Katie's story as well. And also behind that was a sharp dichotomy between the holy and the ordinary. What we might term today the secular and the sacred. There was no freedom to marry. There was no freedom to pursue anything outside or contrary to this order of living. And so you might wonder, though, okay, so did Katie have similar crisis, a similar personal spiritual crisis to Luther? And I found no record that Katie experienced what Luther experienced in terms of the same kind of morbid introspection or obsession over sins. However, she had to experience at least some inner turmoil and strife and questions. And we say, how do you know that? Well, that's evidenced by her desire to leave this life. And so there were doubts and reservations. And those were perhaps most significantly confirmed in Luther's writings, or by Luther's writings. It was through reading the writings of Martin Luther that she was compelled to leave or to escape. By 1522, Luther's writings were spreading like wildfire. Luther had a friend who used to deliver items to this particular convent, and there's some notion that the abbess actually allowed Luther's writings to come in and to circulate. So whether the abbess allowed them to come in and circulate, or whether these writings were simply smuggled in, Luther's work began to gain traction with these nuns. Luther wrote a treatise in which he rejected monastic vows because he said there's no higher order of vows for Christians. He said you cannot find this in Scripture. And Luther had already begun writing in 1520 that priests should marry as well. And so Luther is poring over the Scriptures, and he's teaching the Scriptures, and he's saying there's no higher order of vows there for Christians. But the heart of Luther's protest was this idea that the cloistered life was necessary for one's personal holiness or even one's salvation. That one must retreat from the world, that one must surrender all choices and all freedoms in order to love God singularly. Luther saw this as a false dichotomy. He would emphasize surrender to God, but surrender to God would come under different terms, under the terms of the gospel. Luther wrote, "But now in light of the gospel, we plainly see who they are whom Christ and his apostles call saints. Not they which live a single life, or straitly observe days, meats, and apparel, and other such things, or in outward appearance do other great and monstrous works, as we read of in many of the lives of the fathers. But they which, being called by the sound doctrine of the gospel, and they which are baptized and do believe, they be sanctified and cleansed by the blood. They are the ones that are sanctified and cleansed by the blood of Christ. Whoever then believes in Christ, whether they be men or women, bond or free, are all saints, not by their own works, but by the works of God, which they receive by faith." To conclude, they are saints. Those people are saints through a passive, not an active, holiness. And so this idea of justification by faith alone, the teaching of the gospel, that we become saints through believing the gospel and believing what God has done for us in and through Christ. That's what compelled these nuns to consider, in many ways, escaping the convent. Those were the writings that were taking hold of them in their hearts. And so they wrote to their families to ask if they could leave. Katie wrote to her brother, but she had little hope that he would receive her. And so in the spring of 1523, on Easter Eve, 12 nuns who had taken a vow of silence enacted a really well-orchestrated plan to escape. In the middle of the night, under the deep cover of darkness, they quietly climbed into the back of a fish wagon, maybe even hiding in barrels that carried herring. I don't know if you've ever had herring to eat, but it does not have the most pleasant smell. So you can imagine these nuns climbing in the back of this wagon and having a fish barrel put over them and then traveling that way. 3 of them went home to their families, while 9 of them had nowhere to go. and Katie was one of the 9. And so similar to Luther, it was the gospel and teachings around the gospel that led Katie away from the monastic life and even to take great risks. But here was the problem. Katie was a runaway nun. She was a runaway nun with nowhere to go. And this sets us up for the next sort of recovery, and that's the recovery of marriage. Katie had no dowry. You say, what's a dowry? A dowry was property or money brought by a bride to her husband in marriage. And so that meant she was at a significant disadvantage because there was nothing about her that would be appealing to a man and his family to ask her for marriage. She fell in love with a man, but as I said, she brought nothing to the marriage, and this was a problem for his family. And so the man's family arranged an engagement with a younger lady who had a large dowry. Katie loved this man, and she found out he left town, told her he was going to come back, and he never came back, and she found out through a letter. And so you can imagine what this news did to her and how that made her feel, but even more so, what the prospects of the future held for her. And so Katie appeared to have no choices, and 2 years went by without a suitor. And that's when Luther stepped in. But Luther stepped in to propose a suitor for Katie, but she would not accept this person that he proposed. And here's what she said. She said this man was stubborn, he was opinionated and argumentative and miserly, and he was a pastor. So maybe not a good commentary on pastors, but apparently he was quite insufferable as he was eventually removed from his congregation because he argued so much with his parishioners. Hopefully that'll never happen to any of us. But it took a lot of courage for Katie to refuse a man. And why did she refuse him? Because she did not respect him. And so she had no real options, but she still exercised discretion in this moment. She said she would be willing to marry Nicholas van Almsdorf or Martin Luther. And so Katie must have seen something in Luther that was trustworthy, something that was noble, something that was worthy of marriage. And so it's an interesting spot for Luther to be. He's leading this Reformation movement, but he's single. He has all this freedom, but he's proclaiming that marriage is a good instituted by God, that it's not divorce from singular devotion to God. So he proclaimed that he believed in marriage, and he was writing all these wonderful things. Well, you can see the pickle that Luther was in. He had to put his money where his mouth is. He needed some skin in the game. And so in the late spring of 1525, Luther began to write about the possibility of marrying. And then on June 13th, 1525, in a small ceremony, Luther married Katie. The engagement and the wedding seem to have taken place on the same day. So that's quite unusual. But Luther, in his usual way, gave his reasons for marrying. And this is an interesting part of their story together in terms of why they married. And for us, thinking about the foundation of a good marriage, a holy marriage, a joyful marriage. Here's what Luther said. Luther said he was marrying because it would please his Father, it would rile the Pope, and cause the angels to laugh and the devils to weep. And so it's important to note, you say, well, that's an odd reason, that this is not an American love story. It can disappoint us in that way, where two people just fall in love and they're swept off their feet and they can't help it. That's not what this was. Luther did not marry for love. He married, he said, to spite Satan. And you may say, well, is that a good reason to get married? Well, when you kind of invert that statement and that sentiment, you can see Luther's logic a little bit. Why would he marry to spite Satan? Well, Luther reasons Satan does not want joyful, happy marriages. but God does. And the best way for him to spite him is to commit to a joyful and a happy marriage. And so you can hear some of that in Luther. But most significantly, Luther saw marriage as an institution that was a good. It was a gracious provision from God. And these were all fresh winds, new tides and springs flowing into the church. And so Luther was compelled to marry and to teach on marriage. We could say Luther entered marriage bound to his teaching, and that the backdrop of his marriage was actually the freedom of the Christian and the joy of the gospel. Think about your own marriage. What's the backdrop for your marriage? Is it the freedom of the Christian and the joy of the gospel? There's a lot to learn from this. Luther would marry Katie not for romance, but out of virtue, out of faith, and out of service. And Katie would enter the bonds of marriage for security, yes, for place, yes, but ultimately for similar reasons, or she would have taken an earlier provision. And so their love for one another would grow out of a gospel commitment. And as I said, that's a lesson for us. That's the incubator for an expression of love. Love is necessarily tied to what is true, to what is good, to what is beautiful. Romance, the passions are not evil, they're not wrong, but they are the fruit and not the root of love. And that's what we see in this recovery of marriage with Martin and Katie. It tells us something about Christian marriages, that they must be adorned by and anchored in gospel realities. And so marriage was a calling. And in the freedom of the gospel, Luther stepped into it. And in this, we can see the recovery of marriage. Well, third backdrop that zeroes in a little bit more on her life is the recovery of the home. The Luthers took up residence where Luther lived as a monk. It was known as the Black Cloister because of the black robes worn by members of the Augustinian order who lived there. Now, the conditions there were quite simply conditions only for a single man. This is evidenced by Luther's bed. It had been nearly a year since Luther had changed his bed, which was made out of straw. So you can imagine what that was like. Luther said he simply had not noticed the smell because he said he was so exhausted by the time he went to bed, he just rolled over and went to sleep. And so Katie had her work cut out for her as she moved into this place. And this is where we see, if there ever was a Proverbs 31 woman, it was Katie Luther. She rose at 4 a.m. to start working, and she often worked until 9 p.m. Luther witnessed that and was rather amazed at how she approached daily life. He called her the morning star of Wittenberg. And so Katie began to clean up the place, whitewashing the walls of the former monastery. And not only did she clean the place up, but she was industrious as well. She acquired farms and gardens. She began to even manage a brewery out back. And she would begin to manage the financial aspects of Luther's home as well. And so we see Katie as industrious, but not only that, she played the role of confidant as well. And so she was great at multitasking. We can see Katie as a confidant, a doctor, a gardener, a fisher, a brewer, a beekeeper, a chef, and a conversationalist around the table. And so she's a great testimony to this sort of Proverbs 31 vision. And with Katie's contribution, day by day, the Black Cloister was converted into the Luther House. And we see much in the way of hospitality and generosity here. Luther House was a place where all of these things were formed and celebrated. It was host to many students, and many times people would stay free of charge. Luther accepted no honoraria for his writings. Here's what he said, his approach to finances. God put fingers in our hands for the money to slide through them so he can give us more. And this was true of the Luther house. It became just this place of generosity. And so Katie would extend that generosity, but she would also bring order to the finances as well. When debt for the Luther house got out of control, it was Katie who brought things back in line. She called on the students and guests who could do so to give a little money. And even under this restructuring of the budget from Katie, the Luther house grew more and more. And so their home was not just about growing in terms of people, but it was also a hub for community as well. Dinner marked a significant occasion in the Luther house. We have something to learn from there. What does dinner mark for us? Katie served as the hostess and graciously provided meals and beer from her own brewery to the many guests who would stay and eat there. Katie would account for the guests and where they would sit, and Luther would preside over the conversations, beginning by asking about the latest news, etc. Now, Katie had the kind of intellect as well that allowed her to voice opinions and be spiritually curious. And so no doubt her education in the convent enabled this. And it's interesting that these conversations around the table were recorded by Luther's students. And you can read about them in a book called Table Talk. Around the table, their conversations would turn towards serious questions. And sometimes just questions and conversation between Martin and Katie. Katie wondered, how could she be both a saint and a sinner at the same time? Why did David appeal to God on the basis of his righteousness, she would ask. She also asked Luther why it seemed that they prayed less frequently and less fervently since leaving the Catholic Church. Katie, Luther said, knew the Psalms also better than all the papists. And so they would have serious conversations, but they also enjoyed banter as well. Katie would tell Luther on many occasions that his comments were over the top, and when he would go too far, she would joke with him that she was going to leave him with all the children and go back to the nunnery. Katie would keep Luther's feet grounded in these ways. And Luther would write about the comforts and trials as well of being married. One on New Year's Day when Martin wept and cried out loud, this is little Martin, for over an hour. No one could quiet him. And Luther and his wife were feeling this domestic burden. And Luther mused, it is because of these inconveniences and burdens of married life that everyone becomes frightened and appalled by it. And they do not want to get married. And Luther said, this is why, Luther opined, that none of the church fathers wrote anything particularly good about marriage. I don't know that that's true, but that was Luther's thought on it. And so if home life is a struggle for you, take heart. Luther and Katie felt it as well. Through all of this, they had this amazing ability to form relationships around the truths of the gospel that they discussed, and to form hospitality and generosity. And so what's the point of all of this? The point is that there's this subtle movement here in the Reformation, which situates the home, not the monastery, as the center of practical Christian life. This holiness of the ordinary. In this we see a great recovery and a remarkable potential for the home and the family to be a place of God's work. And so it gives us a little bit of a different vision. You know, if work around the home can be a major frustration, unless you realize that the church and the home have a common mission. And in Luther and Katie's life, we see this common mission that came together. And the family as this amazing place, the ability to reach others and to provide place and occasion in Christian community. And in that way, we could argue that one of the major contributions of the Reformation was this kind of hospitality that was going on. And their home was certainly a hub and center for that. And it's also the recovery of the high calling of the ordinary into the holy. There were struggles. Luther and Katie had 6 children, and 2 of them died. Elizabeth at 9 months and Magdalena, who died at 13. And the loss of each child was devastating. Luther, as he dealt with his grief, he said that when he was fearful and worried, he often felt like he was bathed in cold sweat. All he could do was lie next to Katie. He said this, he said, "I had the biggest struggles with the devil with Katie by my side." Luther said, "I wouldn't give up my Katie for France or Venice." You see all this through Christian commitment and all that she meant to him and all that he meant to her. When Luther died in 1546, Katie said, he gave so much of himself in service not only to one town or to one country, but to the whole world. Yes, my sorrow is so deep that no words can express my heartache, and it is humanly impossible to understand what state of mind and spirit I am in. I can neither eat nor drink, not even sleep. God knows that when I think of having lost him, I can neither talk nor write in all my suffering. Here we see Katie's heartbreak over Luther's death. And we see Luther's anxiety, even before he died, for his wife and his family. Luther commented about his wife and children before he died. "I pray that when I die, my wife and my children may not live very long, for dangerous times lie ahead." Luther's words there proved to be prophetic. Katie and the children, after Luther's death, they were driven from Wittenberg in 1546 by the Schmalkaldic War. Katie bounced around for about a year, only to return to find the Luther house had been plundered and damaged by war. And as she returned, she labored to keep something of a boarding house at the Black Cloister, but she would struggle to make ends meet. She would make appeals to others for money, and some who had a promised pension to Luther, even the King of Denmark, but to no avail. There's an account said to be written by Philip Melanchthon, who was Luther's understudy, that was published under a different name in 1560. Written under the name of Wittenberg University rector Paul Eber, it tells us of Katie's condition. Here's what it says. "For after she had accepted the very painful blow of the death of her husband, who she was grieved had died in a strange place, where she was not able to stay, and demonstrated her faithfulness and fulfilled the final duties for her dying husband, she then wandered around in exile during the war which followed, with orphaned children in extremely difficult circumstances and dangers." Katie had to escape Wittenberg because of the plague and because of war. And while fleeing the plague in 1552, the plague in Wittenberg, Katie died after a terrible accident with her wagon and her horses. She was only 53 years old. And so the ending of her life seems to be something of a tragedy. Katie died as a destitute widow after so many years of fruitful service and love. Well, what do we make of her life? It's interesting that Katie began her life as an orphan and ended it as a widow. There's an interesting bookends for such a significant life. It's these that James marks out as having a special place in the mission of the church. He tells us that pure religion is to look out for widows and orphans. For in attention to these, One's life is preserved from the pollution of the world, he says. As I reflect on that and on Katie's life, I can't help but to think that to live and die in the shadows of being an orphan and a widow is, in the world's eyes, a tragedy. But in God's economy, a life well lived. There's a great irony in the circumstances of Luther and Katie's marriage. In 1523, when a poor nun, destitute with nowhere to go, showed up in Wittenberg, it was Luther that thought he was rescuing her by providing her with security and companionship. But one could argue that it was the great reformer who needed to be rescued. He needed to be rescued with companionship. He needed to be rescued with a helpmate. And the Lord graciously offered him this in Katie. When we think of the Reformation, we might think of what really gave wheels to it. And certainly it was the truths of the gospel and the work of the Holy Spirit. And we think of great teachers and great pastors. We might even think of the printing press, which gave wheels to the Reformation. But one could also argue that so did the lives of people like Katie Luther. There not only needed to be a rediscovery of the gospel, but a certain kind of relocation, a movement from the cloister to the church to the home, where the truths of the gospel could flourish and find expression, where ordinary life could embody the holy. How did the Reformation begin to reshape the way we view a life of consecration? And how did it begin to reshape Christian community? That's a great question. And I think Katie's life is a real contribution in displaying that answer. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Father in heaven, we're grateful for the saints. We're grateful for the history and heritage that you've given to us. We're grateful most of all for the truths that formed their lives. And so, Lord, I pray that you would make us good students of the Word and good students of history, that we could uncover these gems and that we would learn from them and that we would grow in grace because of them. We thank you for that. In Christ's name, amen.